From a Canadian history perspective, it's important because this is the single largest group emigration from Canada in Canadian history. So we emphasize people coming to Canada, but in this instance, a very large group left Canada.
They are a group that are centered around family, church, and community. Their traditions go back to the Reformation. They focus on education as a way of molding their own communities rather than becoming part of a state citizenry.
And they left Canada because they felt Canada betrayed them and trying to mold them into people they did not want to be.
So the Mennonites began out of a larger group called the Anabaptists in the Radical Reformation of the 16th century. Lots of people have heard of Martin Luther. He's the one who started the Protestant Reformation.
And then there were a group of people who thought that Luther, for instance, hadn't gone far enough.
Within the larger Reformation, an Anabaptist movement emerges in Switzerland and grows and expands, moving northward, and it ends up in a place that we now know as the Netherlands, but was known as Holland.
And Anabaptists were part of what we call the Radical Reformation.
Like the most radical of the Protestants, those who went the farthest. That ultimately religion meant taking the Gospels literally and following Christ as closely as one can in this world.
Especially on the question of baptism.
Only believing adults should be baptized, not infants.
They believed that you should be baptized when you're fully conscious of what you're doing.
Symbol of an adult choosing to join Christianity.
This was treason, virtually treason, because there was nothing like the idea that if you were not baptized, that you were not a subject of a certain ruler. So who would you be if you were only baptized as an adult?
So Anabaptists called for a division between the church and state.
This is just one of many radical ideas that emerge out of the Anabaptist movement that will shape a new understanding of their relationship with the state, including pacifism.
Christians shouldn't take up arms, and so they believed in non-resistance.
In German, they called it Wehrlosigkeit, or defenselessness. You should not take up the sword.
They believed that one shouldn't be forced to swear oath based on the teaching, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
And these were kind of the distinctives.
These radical ideas draw more followers and also the wrath of the religious establishment, both Catholic and Protestant officials, who are very intertwined with state structures.
There was martyrdom. People died for this idea, and many took it up, but only a few kept it.
And then Anabaptism divided into a number of groups. Included amongst those are Mennonites, and they take their name from Menno Simons, a leader who was a Catholic priest, converted into the Anabaptist group, and became a prominent leader and speaker among the Anabaptists.
Two groups that become identified with the Mennonites, one in the Netherlands, one in Switzerland, and both adhere to radical ideas.
And the Mennonites are the largest surviving groups of the Anabaptists.
Both groups experience persecution, but the group in the Netherlands will experience an intensification of that persecution.
And so in a sense, the persecution was more ferocious, if you will, in the Netherlands, short-lived and ferocious than was in Switzerland.
And so they start migrating, fleeing essentially, into territory where they receive more religious freedom.
Then the Mennonite story has become very much entwined with the idea that, in a sense, we're not home in this world, so it doesn't matter where we live. We need to live where we can live out the teachings of Christ. And so their story then becomes one of almost endless migration.
And so gradually they moved to Danzig, to what was today Poland.
So that it's the Polish Catholic kings who are especially tolerant by 16th century standards. And they are open to accepting any kind of persecuted folks to their country. Dikes had been breached by late 15th century wars, and they were in need of repair, and the Polish king saw that this would be mutually beneficial and turned it into one of the most richest farmlands in Europe.
They are allowed to settle the lowlands around Danzig, a place known as the Vistula Delta. They live their Anabaptist heretical lifestyle without having to do military service. This is a privilege granted by the Polish king.
Prussia was part of what they called the Hanseatic League, which did operate its affairs in what they called neither Saxon Low German.
They still use Dutch in church, but Low German becomes the language of interaction within the community.
And this became the language of every day, and gradually developed all kinds of cultural practices that began to define somebody as a Mennonite.
They are living separately in their Mennonite communities, but this is the 17th century and Europe is changing, and the Prussians conquer the place where Mennonites are living. German gets introduced into their religious lifestyle through printed Bibles and hymns.
Then gradually the language for church became High German.
However, the Prussians do not like Mennonite exemption from military service, and they challenge them on this issue.
The Prussian king looked at his new subjects and said, "What? They don't want to serve in the military?"
Prussian rulers begin to reconsider this exemption that Mennonites have traditionally had in these lands.
Began to restrict them buying more land.
The Mennonites in Prussia are now looking for a new home, one where they can still have exemption from military service and practice their Anabaptist faith.
In 1789, they go from Prussia to Russia at the invitation of Catherine the Great, who's inviting Europeans to come and settle newly conquered territory that is under her reign.
In 1789, Mennonites have just sort of moved to High German in church, but of course Low German in the everyday.
You know, they received a certain number of privileges when they came to Russia, and this became known as the privilegium.
The privilegium, which they had taken great pains to get Paul, the successor to Catherine the Great, to formally put in writing.
Among the privileges that they received were exemption from military service.
In 1789, they begin these colonies, the Old Colony and the Chortitza Colony, and then the Malachna Colony a few years later, the mother colonies, the main colonies. They had German language schools, they had their own, sort of what we would call municipal administration, and virtual autonomy.
Ethnically, linguistically, and how they operate in terms of even setting up the physical structure of their villages.
In the early years, never learned Russian at all.
And so in Russia, all of these patterns of living that they've accumulated along the way become traditionalized.
Where Low German now acquires status of a linguistic tool, a social boundary, if you will. Now it actually begins serving a purpose of keeping the Mennonites separate from the Russian society.
The Mennonite colonies go on for decades with few issues, but Catherine II and Paul I are mortal. The world changes, and so does Russia.
In 1855, there was the Crimean War. Russia didn't do well in the Crimean War, and so the Tsar said it's time to modernize Russia, you might say. So there's a series of reforms involving education, involving sort of municipal government.
Schools need to be operated in the Russian language, and they need to be administered according to the Russian system, so put under governmental authority.
The one that, of course, will be the biggest for the Mennonites is the loss of military exemption, which they believed that the Tsarina had promised them.
Very roughly, 1/3 of the Mennonites find it objectionable to even perform some form of alternative service.
And so the most traditional groups kind of say we can't give up these things because they're fundamental to who we are as a community.
Often in migration we think of pushes and pulls. By the 1860s, there's a real pressure on land, and it's really a crisis that the Tsar has to intervene in order to allow farms to be divided, and colonies had to eventually put away money to establish additional colonies.
The more conservative Mennonites start something that becomes a pattern. They send out a delegation to look for new territories. Most importantly, a privilegium.
In 1873, the delegates from Russia who come to check out America.
The United States basically says, you don't need military exemption in the United States because we don't intend to be in any great war for the next 100 years. So then they come to Canada, and 4 of the 12 delegates then like what the Canadian government extends to them, and that is, yes, we will give you military exemption. And not only will we give you military exemption, we will override the terms of the Dominion Lands Act, and we'll allow you to settle in villages, and really importantly for Mennonites, we will allow you to have your own schools.
That key clause that said they could, educate their children in the manner of their choosing without being molested.
Canada, of course, was looking for European immigrants at that time to fill newly acquired territories.
Canada became a nation in 1867.
There was a culture undergirding that political act, and that culture was a grandiose plan of a British Canadian nation.
This vast area of the Canadian West was purchased from the Hudson Bay Company.
That would stand vis-a-vis, the Republic of the United States to the south. And this would be sea to sea.
Treaties with indigenous peoples are made. The colonial project is really underway.
And you need settlers.
1896, Clifford Sifton becomes the Minister of the Interior. He's very aggressive, and he believes that the West should not be settled by city folk, but by sturdy farmers. But in 1870s, it's not really working very well. Of all of the people who will migrate from Russia, most of them will go to the United States, Kansas, Nebraska, and so on. The attraction of the United States is huge. And so Canada's getting kind of desperate to get settlers for this vast territory. Mennonites then are one of the first ones who actually come and stay in the period of time before this big takeoff. So they're really prized possessions, you might say.
And the 7,000 of the 17,000 who chose Manitoba did so almost entirely because of the deal that the Canadian government was willing to make with the Mennonites.
They stopped in Ottawa and got this famous letter, the Low Letter, which outlined these privileges. It was their belief that they had a privilegium. Now, the first thing we should point out is that Canada is a democracy, so it isn't the same as it was when the Tsarina promises or the Prussian king promises.
And in fact, the letter that the Mennonites received from the federal government in 1873 is, you are accorded freedom of education according to the law of the land. And of course, Mennonites take that back as sacred. That's a sacred trust and a sacred promise from the Canadian government.
Some historians argue that because Canada was still under a monarchy, that Mennonites thought, this is going to be like that. The Queen is behind this, kind of.
Right? So the Mennonites come to Manitoba with the idea of having a separate society.
This is a longer process in which negotiations and decisions are made within the community, and it will take quite a while for everyone to get themselves organized in order to make this migration happen. The groups that move are the Burgtaler, the Kleine Gemeinde, and another group that comes out of what's known as the Old Colony in Russia, which was the Hortitsa colony.
7,000 come to Canada in 1874 and land in Manitoba.
These Mennonites, the conservative ones that leave Russia, settle in the East and West Reserve. There's an indigenous population that is in the area, in a territory where there is very little oversight of provincial government over these Mennonites who are settling in this region.
Mennonite settlements often occur immediately following the government expelling a group of people or violently repressing on Indigenous people claiming their rights to their land and their culture.
The Métis are really essential, helping them and establishing relations in some of the initial settlement.
Some of the people integrate with their surroundings, are interested in, for example, doing business, learning about the surrounding culture. And other people are very concerned with maintaining their community boundaries.
So they had, in the 1870s, when they come to Canada, they actually take a step back from some of the changes that had happened within Russia because they thought they had gone too far down this path towards worldliness.
Mennonite history in Manitoba is pretty simple, right? There's three groups that come. But what happens almost instantaneously is division and dynamics, and very much over the idea of schools. The Manitoba government, as an early initiative, attempts to get Mennonites to register their schools with the government. In exchange, we'll give them a $100 annual fee, which is a lot of money in the 1870s. The 1,000 Kleine Gemeinde from the Western Colony, who are used to a bit of a more progressive education, take the money, but the Burgtalers refuse it.
The world is quickly changing. Canada is looking for settlers. They are engaged in this process of building a nation. As the communities grow, Mennonites will move into Saskatchewan and Alberta as well.
So in Manitoba, eventually the French Catholic school district is phased out. so it becomes only English speaking. This obviously results in conflict between the French and English in Manitoba. But in the midst of that, all of the immigrant communities who are relying on private education in their own languages, they all get swept up in the changes to the legislation as well. So 1897, the Laurier-Greenway Agreement makes some accommodation for minority education again, which says, okay, we will give some minority rights to education again. Minority languages will be allowed back into schools, and religious instruction can be held, but only when there's a certain number of parents who want it for their children. And all of that instruction can only happen in the last half hour of the school day.
Tried to placate ethnic groups, at the same time keeping them as happy settlers, at the same time thinking that sometime in the future we will come down and assimilate these groups. We just got to give them time.
Some Mennonites adapt to this new school program, English language schools, but others are wedded to the idea of having their own separate private German language schools. And they pay for these schools entirely out of their own pocket, and even as the government offers them finances to switch over to a public school education model, they continue to pay for their own private schools.
And people start taking note that these groups, not just Mennonites, but including Mennonites, are still speaking their languages. They're not assimilating into Canadian English-speaking culture.
Governments start to care about education. For a long time, governments didn't care about it. They weren't interested in it. And Mennonites ran their own schools, and they taught their children to read when other groups were not necessarily emphasizing the need for literacy in their own communities. Mennonites were already doing that, but it's when the government becomes interested and it starts to attach these other types of criteria onto education that all of a sudden Mennonites can't live. It's the creation of education within the modern world.
For reports of that time, you see things like, we need the schools to be a common solvent of immigrant communities. The parents are too hard to reach, but the kids, we can get them and we can bring them into the broader Canadian British system.
Modern governments have a specific idea of education, and Mennonites simply do not fit into that structure.
The Manitoba government proclaimed the flag policy that every school had to fly. Certainly the more conservative Mennonites thought that was promoting nationalism and ultimately warring, Mennonites going to war.
So some Mennonites are assimilating into Canadian culture. They are engaged with consumerism and materialism that old colony leaders don't feel reflect the Mennonite worldview. And so there is this tension that is arising within the community as some begin to engage more within the society around them, and others want to put up barriers and boundaries to protect their children from future engagement with this culture. Some choose to send their children to English language schools and end up excommunicated by the church. In 1908, there is a commission that is established to investigate this issue, and over the course of 2 days, meetings are held between members of the government of Saskatchewan and members of the community to discuss this issue of education within Mennonite communities in Saskatchewan.
Do I understand you to say that the Word of God teaches you not to send your children to the public school? Yes, because God's Word says about Moses, "What I instruct you today thou shalt take to heart, and instruct thy children."
So this is all confusing to the Mennonites, who believed that their right to private school education was established for almost 50 years ago.
That we take that we want to teach God's Word in the schools and so forth, which privilege has been granted to us from the high government.
They believe that there should be no interference in their schools, but there is.
12 of the leading private schools were visited during the year. In 7 of these, both the English and German languages were taught. In the other 5, only the German language was taught, and the teaching in most of them was much inferior to that observed in the public schools.
And then, of course, along comes the First World War.
You get this sense that we are Canadians and we need to be good citizens and we need to be good British citizens.
At the beginning of World War I, there is this increase in militarism within Canadian society, and Mennonites shun these types of feelings or this type of expression of patriotism. Mennonite men are exempt from military service as laid out in the 1873 Privilegium. And so they're already viewed suspiciously. In addition to that, they speak German, which is the language of the enemy during this period. Resentment builds among other people within Canada as this group is allowed to have this privilege that is not given to others.
1915, the Manitoba government sends inspectors out to all schools in the province, and they compile reports. They're done on Mennonite schools and all the different private schools in the rural areas, as well as schools in Winnipeg.
There's a conversation happening within the government as well and within society, and they're responding to public opinion. And this is not going to be a popular move if you allow this group to remain separate.
They petition the government, they send representatives.
Managed to get a meeting with the Premier Norris and the Minister of Education, Thornton. And this is done through Valentine Winkler, who is the provincial representative in southern Manitoba.
They contended that the norms of their education could not be established by outsiders, because Mennonites considered themselves responsible to God alone in this matter. That instruction in religion and the German language were indispensable ingredients in the right instruction of the children.
Mennonites plead their case going back to the agreement of 1873. Premier Norris assures them that if they operate their schools privately, they won't be affected. But not long after comes into play English language legislation in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. This will put an end to all non-English language schools, including the French ones.
In this dominion, we are building up, under the British flag, a new nationality.
The main amendments are that instruction needs to be in the English language.
There should be one common school. There should be one standard of teacher eligible to teach at all schools of the province.
Teachers need to be accredited by the provincial system, and there are certain subjects that are compulsory at that point.
A grave injustice has been done to the children that do not receive a satisfactory education in English.
And attendance at those schools is compulsory for all children between the ages of 7 and 14.
But not until 1916 did you have to go to school. So then there's compulsory attendance.
Saskatchewan will enact the similar types of legislation, and years of conflict will follow.
And so the federal government makes all these promises. The Canadian government gains something. They have a colonial program in place. Mennonites fit the bill. So Canada gains something, Mennonites gain something.
Now, when the order was processed into law, you might say, it became a Privy Council order, an order of the cabinet, and that one key phrase was added. They would be in control of their education as provided in law.
Of course, this is a promise that Ottawa cannot make. The Constitution, the BNA Act, clearly states that education is a provincial responsibility.
So, as provided in law, at the time, it was the law. If the province decided to change the law, it could.
Just under, almost about 50 years ago, you clearly said this. We came here on that premise, and now you're pulling this back.
There's probably no reason to believe that the government deliberately misled Mennonites here. Some historians point out that the Privy Council order was kept confidential, secret. That was because the Russian government didn't want the British Empire to be fooling around with its citizens and promoting immigration, so they had to keep that kind of quiet. It wasn't really to deceive Mennonites.
Mennonites feel as if they had an agreement in place, and now the government is going back on their word.
Mennonites realize to their horror that, we can't in fact have our own schools in Canada because the provinces will decide this.
And the confrontation gets worse and worse until where the government creates public school divisions, names them in Grunthal and the East Reserve. The school is named Aldershot, which is a British military base.
There's a Randolph, there's a Shakespeare, and there's a Moray. These are school districts.
Sort of in-your-face harshness.
So public schools are being built in Manitoba Mennonite communities, regardless of whether there's already a private one in place and whether the community has agreed to send their children to this public school.
They're arbitrarily set up. In some cases, the school teacher sits there without any students.
In an empty classroom, teaching absolutely nobody.
Because it wasn't illegal to have a private school. But then, of course, the pressure comes onto the private schools, too. You know, it says in one case that they're not teaching any English and very little of anything else.
Sometimes the teachers are terrible, but sometimes they aren't. They're seeing Mennonite schools through a very specific lens of being something that needs to be drastically changed. And so they judge them that way.
We can't have these children growing up knowing no English, virtually, and we're fighting Germany, you know, who's the enemy.
Well, the situation there is very unfortunate. I have never been able to see how we can allow them to continue. To have schools where they learn nothing but their own language, the Bible, and catechism.
This conservative group represents only a part of the Mennonite community in southern Manitoba. So some Mennonites agree to send their children to public schools and embrace these new changes. So there's a split within the community as to how they react to this educational change.
You have to remember that our sort of notion of Canada today, that it's somehow a multicultural or diverse society, that isn't there.
And the government forces the English language school system then on to the Mennonites, if you will.
It got to be a hard standoff.
Mennonites who refuse to send their children to these schools are imprisoned. There's dozens imprisoned in Saskatchewan especially.
When Magistrate H.J. Newton sent Peter Wall and Klaus Dick, Mennonite farmers, to Prince Albert for 15 days hard labor, the court ordered both men to pay fines of $10 and costs each. The farmers refused. They said it was against Mennonite principles to pay fines in such cases and preferred to go to jail.
Conservative Mennonites are not anti-education. They are not against education.
We want to write to you about our schools. As you know, the Mennonite people are very anxious that their children should be educated, and they should send their children to school.
But they see education as a way in which they can build their faith community, they can build participation within their own communities. So they don't view education as a way and means of building citizenship or engaging with the state or even engaging with material culture. They don't view education as a stepping stone by which their children will have access to a better future. They see the best future for their children as being within the community.
They don't know the use of fear and fining them, for sending them to jail will not make any difference to them, if the thing does not seem right to their conscience. We had a man here for many years who tried to make our people go to the public school with the big stick. But the end was that a lot of our people quit the public school system.
Over an issue in which they thought the government had already been acting in bad faith. And this just reinforced that view that the government couldn't be trusted.
There is a sense of betrayal on the part of the more conservative Mennonites.
You claim no law affects Mennonites in the matter of education, a witness was asked. Up to this date, we have always understood that we could maintain our school under the letter of 1873, was the answer.
Deja vu, right? I mean, this is like Russia all over again.
So the government decided to prosecute parents who did not send their children to schools. In May 1918, there were 50 prosecutions in Manitoba, and 11 Mennonite men were imprisoned for over 10 days. It was very intense. They would fine them. Community had to come together to pay these fines because individuals couldn't necessarily afford to pay them.
When those hadn't paid their fines, the government seized 3 horses, a hog, and 5 cured hams.
So they're taking away the economic ability of a family to survive. And this just intensified the resolve of Mennonites who thought that they were being mistreated. And so that's why they are so adamant about who controls the schools, because they felt that Canada and Manitoba were trying to instill values into their children that did not reflect their community. And these values included ideas of militarism, ideas of secularism, and so that is why there's such a strong reaction on the part of Old Colony leadership. So it's not about being against schools, but it's about being against a certain type of education.
As early as 1919, Mennonites start looking for immigration opportunities.
You know, there's a classic story kind of in the Manitoba Free Press about how the buggies all head toward Rhineland. The main church was in Rhineland for the old colony people. And there's this big meeting to decide on migration.
It's part of their cultural repertoire to migrate. So this isn't like a really radical thing to migrate.
But now the congregations found out, as a well-known experience of our people, that human promises are not to be relied upon. The Manitoba government did not honor the promise made to the Mennonites by the Ottawa government.
The memory of coming from Russia to Canada is so vivid, right? And so the idea of moving someplace isn't like brand new.
The right to self-determination over the schools was taken away from them, and the most oppressive, coercive measures were used to break the resistance of the Mennonites.
You know, there were fines initially, especially in Saskatchewan. The church said they should not pay the fine, so then they went to jail.
I've exhausted every means at my disposal to arrive at some reasonable compromise with the leaders of these people. All the negotiations that I've had with them, spread over a period of years, have entirely failed.
The Mennonites are being made into martyrs within their own communities, and the government realizes it's futile to continue on with the prosecutions. The conservative Mennonites and the government were unable to see each other's position, were unable to have sympathy or empathy with each other's position.
It seems that the whole society, the whole Canadian society, has pulled away the welcome mat for Mennonites.
I beg you, Honorable Sir, to be good enough to grant us 2 years' time to leave this country if you consider us a bad class of people. We believe that we are worthy of such a privilege, at least.
And in order to preserve what they understood as the right way of living, they began to look for another place to live.
And of course, they sent out all these delegations all over the place.
To investigate settlement opportunities, to essentially pitch their resume as successful farmers to various governments.
Some place where they would be able to get those privileges assured again.
The public schools in the old colonies, administered by the Department of Education and backed by the power of the state, are beyond their power to destroy. And because they are the symbols of a new freedom, these clerical leaders are determined to remove their people from the influences that will radiate from them.
They look at various countries in Latin America, they look at the States, they look at other Canadian provinces.
They even consider Quebec as a Catholic society, you know, where religion would be a bigger part, maybe.
Religious groups are allowed their own language schools. It wasn't necessarily German language schools that Quebec had in mind.
Northern Manitoba, they sort of offer almost to settle somewhere out in the obscure frontier and just leave us alone there, you know.
They very seriously considered Mississippi.
Georgia.
They are free to go, of course. This is no Egypt, which keeps unwilling peoples within its boundaries.
These themes of ingratitude, of being people who refuse to assimilate, who don't care about Canadian culture, is very strong within the media.
But if they do, they will look back with regret upon the country they have abandoned, whose gates will be closed against their return.
And of course, politicians who are elected are not going to defend this group. They have nothing to gain by doing so. In the end, some Mennonites decided that they could not live under this system.
And try to find a place where they can be assured that these privileges will again be given, first of all, and maybe kept.
Quite fascinating, you know, if you dive into the diaries and you see Mennonites traveling all over the Americas in a relatively short period of time. They're bouncing around from New York to, you know, Rio de Janeiro. They're taking trains through the US and into Mexico. You know, one of the delegates walks on the beach at Mazatlan, right? Like an early 20th century, you know, beach-bound tourist.
And they were staying in downtown Mexico City, which is colonial Spanish style, and so quite unlike Canada, and also unlike Russia, which some of them may have remembered from childhood.
After a couple preliminary trips in February of 1921 and actually sit down with Alvaro Obregón, the sort of post-revolutionary leader, right? He'd lost his arm fighting in the revolution against Pancho Villa. They sit down with them in 21 and present that same package, right? Promotion of themselves as successful farmers.
Having gone through a revolution, Mexico is intent on breaking up its massive family-owned, clan-owned haciendas.
They said, okay, we're a revolutionary government. They wanted to redistribute land so that all peasants would be able to farm and have free secular public education for all.
There was also this expectation that religious authority was going to be strongly curtailed, and of course this was directed at the Catholic Church, right? The major educator, landowner, and long-running sort of political influencer in Mexico. Obregón represents sort of the conservative consolidation of the revolutionary movement, right? That massive land redistribution for the peasants, the campesinos that fought on the revolution, kind of state formation are pushed onto the back burner.
So it's a huge change.
For Obregón, being a revolutionary, but nevertheless, being a revolutionary with a particular racialized view of events, is particularly eager to get Caucasian Canadian farmers.
Prevailing racial ideology in Mexico in the 1920s was the ideology of mestizaje, or racial mixture, advanced most prominently by José Vasconcelos, who was the Minister of Education in the mid-1920s.
And they call it blancamiento, of whitening, essentially the population, so improving the race is the other term that's often used.
The Mexican government looked at Mennonites as successful farmers and said, here, you'll bring modern farming techniques and you will teach it to the backward Mexican farmers, and therefore we will lift up the Mexican farmers.
Lot of misunderstanding happening because the Mennonites were not ever planning to integrate. That was not at all their goal. They really wanted to live exactly how they had been doing, just in a new country that would let them do that.
Neither seems to understand each other's view of education. However, the Mexican president is willing to give Mennonites privileges, and again, once again in writing, another type of privilegium emerges.
I have the honor to inform you of the following, in answer to questions contained in your aforementioned petition. In no case are you obliged to military service. In no case are you obliged to take an oath. You are fully authorized to establish your own schools with your own teachers, where you can teach in the German language and also practice your religion in the German language without the government interfering in any way.
You talk about push and pull, right? So if the Canadian government is pushing Mennonites, well, there's a huge pull in Mexico.
The Mexican government and these Mennonite leaders signed an agreement for around 6,000 to 8,000 people to come on trains and settle.
It's important again to understand that not all Mennonites decided to leave. Some embraced these changes, were happy to train teachers within their own communities according to the standards of the province, and to integrate their children into public school education.
And it's primarily these old colony folks south of Winkler, and some Sommerfelder and some Kleine Gemeinde would move as well, and of course the people from Saskatchewan.
So the little Mennonite ship continues to drift on the current of time until our Mennonites lose their special status and become like all other peoples. This is what the old colony Mennonites want to avoid.
There's a letter to the Premier of Saskatchewan from a company involved in the land deal. This gives us a fascinating perspective of an outsider to the drama that was unfolding.
The proof of this is the anxiety of the old hidebound leaders to get their colonies away from Canada to a country where they can isolate their followers and thus retain their allegiance.
Revealing that this isn't just about schools, but this is also about cultural assimilation.
Knowing full well that if left in Canada, they will lose them. And the government, by forcing them to go, is playing into their hands, to their secret satisfaction.
The writer believes that some of these conservative Mennonite leaders have already decided to leave, and they're just using this as an excuse. Also shows that maybe they didn't realize all of the costs involved in migration.
And there's also a post-war crisis, right? The high commodity prices sort of collapse, in the early 20s, right? As people are planning to sell, the farm values go down with it.
To uproot your entire life, and also not just your home, but your economic means, your farming equipment and all of that, it's a huge process and procedure to undertake.
They really wanted to sell it in block form. The old colony leaders wanted to do this for a very deliberate reason. They wanted to sort of redistribute effectively wealth within a Mennonite community which had become quite segregated in terms of ownership of land and property. The idea was they would sell the land in block at a set price, regardless of the quality of the land in question, whether someone had made extensive improvements, infrastructure, barns and things like that on the property. And that money would then be used to purchase this new block of land, which would be held with sort of a communal title held by the church, although of course people would have their own private lots in Mexico. The problem though is that it's very difficult to sell this huge block of land all at once. And so speculators approach who are sort of offering pennies on the dollar. They move in 1922, 23, and the land is still sitting there. Deals kind of come and go, and eventually people break from the plan and start to sell off their land individually.
Yeah, there's this hope that this incoming migration of Mennonites from the Soviet Union will allow the Mennonites leaving Canada just to sell their land to this group that becomes known as the Russlander. Russlander refers to Mennonites who migrated from the Soviet Union during the 1920s. They are coming out of war, famine, civil war, so they want to go anywhere they can, and so they are happy to end up in rural Manitoba or Saskatchewan. The selling point of the Russlander to the government is that they are the right kind of Mennonites. They are the good Mennonites, the liberal Mennonites, the Mennonites who will integrate themselves within society. Unlike these other ones that you know all about that are causing you all sorts of problems.
People thought, this would be great. We could sell all the land to the people who want to come. That didn't, in fact, work out that way.
There's delays and delays, and so a lot of Mennonites end up moving to Mexico without having sold their land.
Middle people negotiating these property sales, they did pretty well, but the Mennonites selling their property were often not getting good prices for them.
People from Saskatchewan who suffered terribly. Their land deal fell through and they got embroiled in a legal dispute and it cost them a bunch of money.
So the land in Manitoba and Saskatchewan isn't selling, and the land they bought in Mexico was purchased way over market value.
In the Mexican land redistribution program, the Constitution outlined if you own more than X number of hectares, which changed over the course of the 20th century and depending on if the land was for farmland or for ranching, then we can take part of it and give it to people who don't have any land. Knowing that this was going to happen, the Zuloaga family, who owned the Bustillos Hacienda, made a lot of money off of the Canadian Mennonites who were coming to settle there. A similar story doesn't seem to have happened in Durango.
They lost a fistful of money in all the various transactions that had to go on in order to actually make this move.
The misery is very much larger than what I think you believe. Therefore, if you cannot keep the exemption that was granted to our people, please give us a few years to settle our affairs, we pray. You have my sincere sympathy in the condition in which your people are placed. In relation to the compulsory schools attendance law, I am powerless to do anything outside of what the law says I should do.
And they weren't just sort of reactionary running away. There was an ideology that propelled them. Very much this was definitely a step through following Christ. This was a form of suffering for Christ. They knew that they were moving from rich Manitoba, rich Saskatchewan to privation in Chihuahua and Durango.
There's a new provincial government in 1923 with a new premier, but they just stay the course.
Without hesitation, it must be admitted that the method adopted by the provincial officials to settle the school question with the Mennonites has turned out an absolute failure.
Now, some say that if the government had taken a different approach and hadn't come at them so strongly, that maybe there could have been some compromise eventually reached. We don't know, right? We don't have the material to assess that.
From a Canadian history perspective, it's important because this is the single largest group emigration from Canada in Canadian history. And they left Canada because they felt Canada betrayed them and trying to mold them into people they did not want to be.
We have again the main settlement that takes place in Chihuahua is of Old Colony Mennonites from Manitoba and Saskatchewan. A group also from Saskatchewan from the Hay-Goslar area settles in Durango, a much smaller colony. And then a group of Sommerfelder who are supposed to go to Paraguay opt for Mexico instead. So there's essentially 3 colonies which are established in Chihuahua as a result. You have Manitoba, Swift Current, and Santa Clara, and they're all quite close together.
What you see in the letters, especially in the 1920s and 30s, this sense of life being very difficult in Mexico, acclimatizing to a new environment, learning new farming techniques, learning new building techniques, all of that is very new to them. The skills and experience that they could trust on in Canada no longer stood them in good stead in the Mexican environment.
Crop failure, drought. And so they face a lot of challenges that I don't know that they were anticipating.
Any migration, when you move to a new place, there's often casualties of that move. And there were many deaths when Mennonites first arrived in Mexico, as they had to adapt to the region and the land and also adapt to the environment. And that caused a lot of hardship. There's also a lack of infrastructure there, and people died. Some went to Mexico and decided that they couldn't exist there, that it wasn't going to be for them, and they decided to migrate back, but they had already sold their lands for less money. They'd already lost out in Mexico with the purchase of those lands, and so they found themselves in debt and had really struggled to rebuild their lives in Canada.
And before they'd even purchased the land, there were already a number of people that had occupied the property.
Part of the call of the Mexican Revolution was land reform, to give land to the landless. And so having this big foreign colonist group gather up all this land, to some degree to the expense of the landless peasants, led to a lot of conflict.
Partly because of that problem, the delay in selling their land and arriving meant that there was a period of time in which no one was living on this newly acquired Mennonite land.
So there were skirmishes, there were fences being pulled down, Agarista cattle trampling Mennonite crops. Almost constant conflict, violence happening, sometimes murder. The violence becomes such that military is called in to protect the colonies a number of times in the 1920s and 30s.
Federal troops were actually on hand in the 1930s and shot several people in the context of this occupation.
This is what is really curious, and also is not the only time in history that Mennonites have done this, that in spite of believing that their young men should not participate in military service, Mennonites are willing to accept armed forces to protect their land and property. And so this is what was happening in Mexico in certain parts of the settlement in the state of Chihuahua.
In the midst of land issues, once again, a conflict over schools arises in Mexico. This story comes back to earlier agreements and intentions between Mennonites and the Mexican government.
Coming out of the Mexican Revolution, the new Constitution of 1917, there was this division that was created between the church and the state. And so 1927 sees a new governor come into power in Chihuahua, and he starts implementing some of these things of the new Constitution.
Real fraught question in Mexico as a whole, religious education, representing that old power of the church and the state's desire to overturn that.
Starts this ball rolling, at least in the Manitoba colony, to having school closures in 1935.
Is that an inspector visits the schools in Chihuahua. He tours all of the campos, and he leaves with a very unfavorable report that Mennonite schools are not teaching national curriculum.
That were in the German language, that were using 100% religious texts, so they were using the Bible and the Catechism as what they were teaching children.
And that they should be immediately shuttered. And there's an order to shutter the schools.
Which sends the entire community up in arms. This is the whole reason they came.
There was a Back to Canada movement at that point. People thought, okay, this is not going to work here.
And they start looking for immigration opportunities.
They spend several weeks trying to get an audience with President Lázaro Cárdenas at this point in time. His officials are telling them no.
President Lázaro Cárdenas was deeply beloved by the Mexican people, especially peasants or campesinos in rural areas, because he really got the land redistribution program going. He nationalizes banks, which tells the world that he's a socialist, if not a communist. And part of this was really pushing for the free secular public education for everyone.
While most of the delegates returned to the colonies, one stayed behind and was able to gain an audience with Lázaro Cárdenas, who assured him that the privileges would be recognized.
The schools did reopen in 1936.
Their economic impact, the mechanization that Mennonites had brought in, was perhaps too promising for the federal government to pass up on.
The story of Mennonites in Mexico is turbulent in the early years, but as the community establishes themselves, this group gets down to what they do best, farming and building community.
And so Mennonites had to adapt, and they kind of quickly pioneered some niche markets. They started to introduce oats, became major producers of oats in the region. In the early 1930s, they also brought a practice of dairying with them and became big dairy producers. You read newspaper accounts from that era, start to become described as a regional powerhouse. Wastelands turned into gardens. One journalist says, these are lands that haven't been improved since the time of the conquest that are now flourishing under Mennonite hands, and it's hyperbolic, right? Of course. That's one aspect of the way Mennonites present themselves as model farmers, especially when government officials visit the colonies or outside reporters.
There is change. They don't stick to what they initially started out with. The language does adjust. They take on Spanish words.
Really became clear that Mennonites might maintain a distinct cultural identity and religious identity, but that there's a lot more contact between them and broader Mexican culture than we might expect.
Interaction in the marketplace is where a lot of that interchange takes place. They are still a group where you can very visibly see who's insider and who's outsider. So they've maintained their boundaries in that way, but over time also, there's been conflicts in those communities about how far do we acculturate.
Farming technology changes, and tractors are equipped more and more with rubber tires as opposed to just the steel wheels Mennonites were accustomed to. A debate in the colony emerges over whether Mennonites can use rubber tires on their tractors, and there's eventually a prohibition, right, in order that prohibits the use of rubber tires.
Not having rubber tires is not specifically a sin, and it's not going to prevent you from getting to heaven, but it's what it all represents, right? Faster travel, more interaction with the world,
And then the more conservative groups migrate again. And so every time this happens in Mennonite history, the most traditionalist groups go, and what you're left with are the more accommodating groups.
7,000 or so Mennonites that went to Mexico from 1922 to 27. They make up the majority of about 250,000 Mennonites in Latin America, living in Mexico, Bolivia, Belize, Paraguay, Argentina. There was new settlements just created in the last couple of years in Peru.
There was a consensus within the community that Canada had betrayed them, trying to force its culture onto them as folks who had come here with a very clear intention of maintaining their own cultures from the religious perspective they understood to be true.
These conflicts, they don't take away from their integrity or their stability as a community. In many ways, they reinforce, they serve to strengthen. Now we'll know what these beliefs mean to us if we're willing to give things up for them again.
If we think about the continued use of Low German in Mennonite colonies in Mexico today, the continued survival of the privilegium, the freedom from military service, I think Mennonites did succeed in that migration and preserving an important element of their sort of ethno-religious identity, if we want to frame it that way.
They took this migration despite the fact that it would be a very costly one.
In the world, but not of the world. And so the state is the world. And so if you're not of the world, then the state cannot be telling you how you should raise your children.
It's good in the world to have groups that force us to question what we're doing. Doesn't mean we have to agree with their approach, and many of us, even within the Mennonite community, wouldn't agree with this approach to education. But at least their example allows us to think through, well, what is the purpose of education? What are the values that we want to pass along to the next generation? And what is the world that we want to live in?
I find something about them very inspiring, that they're willing to travel to what they see as the ends of the earth to follow what they understand as God's will. There's real value in community and in preserving community, but there's also a lot of challenges associated with it.